Okay, solving trig functions for applied maths. So what we're going to do is look at angles between 0 and 90, 90 and 180, 180 and 270, and 270 to 360, which is basically back to 0. And we're going to look at what happens when you take the sine, the cos, or the tan of the angles in each of those four quadrants. The top right, the top left, bottom right. So what ends up happening is if you take the sine, the cos, or the tan of any angle between 0 and 90, the answer is always positive. If you took the sine, the cos, or the tan of an angle between 90 and 180, the sine of the angle will work out as positive, the other two will work out as negative. And then if you did the same for the other two quadrants, let's draw the circle. For the bottom left-hand corner, the tan of any angle between 180 and 270 is positive, but the cos of that angle and the sine of that angle will give you a negative number. And then any angle between 270 and 360, the cos of it would be positive and the sine and the tan of it would be negative. So we're going to just I'm going to get you to take out a calculator and just work these out to prove it or to show it. So basically, look, before you take out the calculator, this unit circle is what it's called, tells you where the sine, the cos and the tan of an angle will give you a positive value. So A is for all three will give a positive value when you take the sine, cos and tan of the angle. S is just for sine, that's the positive one, cos and tan are negative. T stands for tan, so the tan of the angle will be positive there, sine and cos negative. And then between 270 and 360, only the cos is positive, the sine and the tan are negative. So calculator time. We start with tan of 30. So tan of 30 is there. And if you get the tan of 30, you should get a positive value. I think it's 1 over root 3. And that should fit in with what I've said there about sine, cos and tan of any angle in that quadrant will work out as a positive value. Now if you go on to tan 120, which is there, you should get a negative value because in that quadrant only the sine is positive, tan will be negative. If you go for tan of 240, that's in the third quadrant, again you should get a positive number because the tan of an angle will be positive in that quadrant. And then the last example, tan of 300, well the angle 300 there is in that quadrant, and that's the fourth quadrant, so only cos is positive, the tan of 300 will give you a negative angle. And those angles there, 30, 120, 240 and 300, are measured from the right hand side, so that would be, this position here would be 0 and you're going anti-clockwise. So 30 degrees here, 120, this one, if you rotated around to 240, you'd get that. And from there, all around to 300. Now on to the next slide. And do the same thing. So cos of 30, it's going to be positive because it's in the first quadrant. Cos of 120, it's in the second quadrant. You'll get a negative value for that. The third one, 240 is there. It's in the third quadrant. The cos of an angle is negative there. And the last one, the cos of an angle is positive there. Okay, and obviously then we're going to go on and do the sine then. So sine of 30 is a half, it's positive there. Sine of 120 is root 3 over 2, so 0.866. That's positive because it's in the second quadrant and sine is positive there. The other two then will be negative because sine is negative in the third quadrant. That will also be 0.866, but you'll have minus 0.866. And the last one will be also minus 0.866. They're deliberately chosen for me to know the answers. Okay, so moving on a little bit from that. If you were calculating the inverse, or if you were using the inverse trig function to calculate an angle when given the sine of the angle, how would you do it? So right now we've got sine of the angle is equal to a half. Well, if you get the inverse sine, you'll get an answer of 30 degrees. But the thing is, the sine of the angle can be positive in two locations. It can be positive in the top right-hand quadrant or the top left-hand quadrant. So in those two locations there. And what the 30 degrees refers to, is the acute angle that the line makes with the x-axis. So that's 30 degrees. There's another acute angle, 30 degrees. So in calculating the second angle here, which is 150, that's 30, so we need to go from 0 anti-clockwise and we'd go all the way around to 150. So if sine A is equal to a half, there are two possible angles in this thing that would give you that answer. If the angle was 30 degrees, which would be this one, in the first quadrant, or if the angle was 150 degrees, which means it's in the second quadrant, which basically comes from the fact that that's 30. So let's have a look at the second one. If the sine of b was equal to minus a half, so if it's a negative value when you get the trig, when you get the sine, cos, or tan of an angle, it means it's going to be in the third quadrant or the fourth quadrant. That is the quadrant where the tan is positive only, or the quadrant where the cos is positive only. Now when you get the inverse sine there, I usually get the inverse sine of the positive value. So I get the inverse sine of a half, that works out as 30 degrees. And like I said, they're located there. The acute angles in both of those, the acute angle it makes with the x-axis in both of those is 30 degrees. But when you're reading an angle, you need to start from 0 and go up and over anti-clockwise. So to go to the line on the bottom left-hand corner, that's in the tan quadrant, we'd have to travel 180 degrees and an extra 30 for it. So that's 210. And then to go to the second line, which is in the cos quadrant, we'd have to travel basically all the way around for 360 degrees, but we subtract 30 off it, so we get 330 degrees. Right, two more. Okay, cos c is equal to minus 0.7077. So what I would do is I would get the inverse cos of plus 0.7077, that's a 45 degree angle. And then what I would do is I would look at where the cos is negative, and it's negative in the second quadrant, and it's negative in the third quadrant. So that's the S and the T. It's negative there and there. The 45 degrees is the acute angle between the horizontal and those white lines. So look, that's 45 degrees and that's 45 degrees. But when asked for what are the angles, in other words to get these values, we'd measure from here counterclockwise to that point there. So it's 180 minus 45, which is 135. And in this case, 180 plus 45 is 225. All right, last set of values. Tan d is equal to minus a half. So I get the inverse tan d is equal to minus 1. I get the inverse tan of 1, that gives me 45 degrees. I pick out where tan is negative in those two quadrants. So that means that angle is 45 degrees, that angle is 45 degrees. And then what I want to do is measure from there over to there, that's 135, and from there all the way around to there, 315. Okay, so the second thing we need to do is solving trig equations. So look at this one. There are two questions, I'll do both. It says, find the exact solution set of each equation if the angle is between 0 and 360 degrees. And the first one there, which is question 3, 2 cos theta minus 1 is equal to 0. Now, I've changed cos theta to cos A because I can't put a theta on this computer, and I've solved for it already. Cos A is equal to a half. Now, that angle then is 60 degrees. So what you need to do then is ask yourself, because cos A is equal to plus a half, where is cos positive? It's the first and the third quadrant, top right and bottom right. So fill in your values there, fill in your lines, and you will see that because it was 60 degrees, you'd have a line here with the angle of 60 there, so that's your first answer. You'd have a line there with the angle between the line and the horizontal being 60 degrees, but travelling from there all the way around would give you 300 degrees. All right, now I'll do the second one as well, but without as much information. Again, 3 tan theta plus root 3 is equal to 0. You'll see there's a mistake here. When you bring it over and divide under by the 3, you'll get tan theta is equal to minus 1 over 3. So these answers are going to be wrong. So minus 1 over 3. And I just call theta b here in this case. So I would get the inverse tan of 1 over root 3, take the positive value. That's 30 degrees. And it should be negative. So it's going to be negative in the second and the fourth quadrant. So the angle of 30 degrees is the acute angle in the second quadrant, which means the angle, the first acceptable angle is going to be 150 degrees. The second acceptable angle is in the fourth quadrant with an angle of 30 degrees between the horizontal and the the angle itself. So that means when you travel from 0 counterclockwise, it's 300 degrees. So those angles are wrong, but hopefully you've been listening and you get the idea. All right, these questions are for you. So simplify them. Basically treat the trig functions as an x or a y, isolate the x or the y, so isolate the trig functions, write as a fraction, and then get the two solutions for both of them. For questions 9 to 14, it says between 0 and 2 pi, ignore it, just put the angle in degrees. And once you have those done, I would then go to these ones and do all of those.